Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. And tonight I'm going to read to you an excerpt out of Langston Hughes' autobiography, The Big C. But before I read this excerpt, I'm going to give an explanation of why I'm going to read this excerpt. Many of us, when we think of Langston Hughes, we think of a gentle, soft-spoken writer of poetry. However, if you read his autobiographies, The Big C and I Wonder as I Wonder, and if you read his short stories in the book The Ways of White Folks, you'll see that Langston Hughes was quite a revolutionary. And he was not just a gentle, soft-spoken poet. When he was a teenager, he went to live with his father in Mexico, a revolutionary Mexico, where his father would not allow Langston Hughes to ride out with him on ventures until Langston Hughes learned how to ride and shoot straight. So Langston Hughes knew how to ride a horse and shoot a gun and hit his mark. And if you read Langston Hughes's short stories in the book The Ways of White Folks, you can tell that Langston Hughes witnessed many horrors in his life due to racism. While he was in Mexico, there was an attempt on his life, and the person who broke into his father's house, upon not finding Langston Hughes, shot a woman in the face, which Langston Hughes found laying on the floor when him and his father arrived to the house. And if you read this autobiography, The Big C, Langston Hughes also writes about living in a racist Chicago, where he arrived home one day very beat up because he crossed into the wrong section of town, and he leaves a note that it was 2 months before the Chicago race riots. So I'm reading this excerpt here because this is an excerpt of when Langston Hughes, in his early 20s, arrived in Africa while he was working on a merchant ship. And in this excerpt, he talks about the exploitation of Africa by America and Europe. And he also talks about Marcus Garvey and how Africans perceived and accepted Marcus Garvey. So this chapter is called Africa on page 101 in the autobiography, The Big C. The crossing was bright and sunny. We reached the Azores, the Canaries, and finally Africa, a long sandy coastline gleaming in the sun, palm trees sky tall, rivers darkening the sea's edge with the loom of their deltas, people black and beautiful as the night, the bare, pointed breast of women in the marketplaces, the rippling muscles of men loading palm oil and coca beans and mahogany on the ship from the white man's world, for that was why our ship was there, to carry away the treasures of Africa. We brought machinery and tools, canned goods, and Hollywood films. We took away riches out of the earth loaded by human hands. We paid very little for the labor. We paid but little more for the things we took away. The white man dominates Africa. He takes produce and lives very much as he chooses. The yield of earth for Europe and America. The yield of men for Europe's colonial armies. And the Africans are baffled and humble. They listen to the missionaries and bow down before the Lord, but they bow much lower before the traders who carry whips and guns and are protected by white laws made in Europe for the black colonies. At that time, 1923, the name of Marcus Garvey was known the length and breadth of the west coast of Africa. And the Africans did not laugh at Marcus Garvey as so many people laughed in New York. They hoped what they had heard about him was true, that he really would unify the black world and free and exalt Africa. They did not understand the terrific complications of the colonial problem. They only knew the white man was there in Africa, heavy and oppressive on their backs, and they wanted him to go away. Our problems in America are very much like yours, I told the Africans, especially in the South. I am a Negro too, but they only laughed at me and shook their heads and said, "You white man, you white man." It was the only place in the world where I have ever been called a white man. They looked at my copper brown skin and straight black hair like my grandmother's Indian hair, except a little curly, and they said, "You white man." One of the crew men from Liberia working on our ship, who had seen many American Negroes of various shades and colors and knew much of America, explained to me. "Here," he said, "on the West Coast, there are not many colored people, people of mixed blood, and those foreign colored men who are here come mostly as missionaries to teach us something, since they think we know nothing. Or they come from the West Indies as clerks and administrators in the colonial governments to help us carry out the white man's law. So the Africans call them all white men." "But I am not white," I said. "You are not black either," the crewman said simply. "There is a man of my color," and he pointed to George, the pantryman, who protested loudly. "Don't point at me," George said. "I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, USA, and no African blood nowhere." "You black," said the crewman. "I can part my hair," said George, "and it ain't nappy." But to tell the truth, George shaved a part in his hair every other week, since the comb wouldn't work. The crewman knew this, so they both laughed loudly, for George's face was as African as Africa. And then Langston Hughes goes on to talk about how dark-skinned Americans do not like to be called dark-skinned, and they don't like to be referred to as having African blood back in the 1920s. So that's a very interesting excerpt, and I still recommend that everyone read The Big C to get a nice background on who Langston Hughes was, and also read I Wonder as I Wonder. His two autobiographies, very interesting, very well written, and I can read this book over and over, and it never ceases to amaze me. So this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.